Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I couldn't believe it when I found out my own brother had been sabotaging me for years just to get ahead in his career. What's worse, my family actually sided with him, telling me to let it go for the family's sake. But the secrets I uncovered made me question everything I thought I knew about them. 2 years ago, I was on the verge of what felt like the defining moment of my career. The promotion was practically mine. At least that's what my manager hinted during our last one-on-one. I had worked tirelessly for it, sacrificing sleep, weekends, and even the chance to visit my best friend's wedding across the country. This is the big break, I kept telling myself. Every late night in the office, every canceled plan, it all felt worth it. I had poured my heart into proving I was ready for this next step. When the email came announcing the new senior lead, my heart stopped. It wasn't me. Instead, the promotion went to Sarah, a recent hire who had only been at the company for 6 months. She was talented, sure, but her experience was nowhere near mine. It was like being sucker-punched in a crowded room where no one noticed or cared. I tried to stay professional, congratulating Sarah with a tight smile while my mind raced with questions. What went wrong? My manager had been so encouraging. Had I misread the situation? Or worse, had I done something to tank my chances without realizing it? The first red flag came a week later, during an innocent coffee run with a colleague named Jake. Jake and I weren't particularly close, but we had always been friendly. As we waited for our drinks, he lowered his voice and said, "Hey, don't take this the wrong way, but I heard something weird the other day about why you didn't get the promotion." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the tension creeping into my voice. Jake hesitated, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "Apparently, someone told HR that you were, hard to work with. Like, unreliable or something." He shrugged. I didn't believe it, but, rumors like that can mess things up. Hard to work with? Unreliable? I was stunned. Those words couldn't be further from the truth. I was the one who picked up extra shifts when others slacked off, who covered for coworkers when they had personal emergencies. I laughed it off in front of Jake, but as I walked back to my desk, my mind churned. Who would say something like that about me? I decided to confront my manager about it. Maybe there had been some misunderstanding, or worse, someone was deliberately trying to sabotage me. I scheduled a meeting with her, determined to get some answers. When I brought up the feedback I'd heard, she looked uncomfortable. "Listen, I can't disclose everything that goes into these decisions," she said, avoiding my eyes. But the promotion wasn't just about performance. There were concerns raised by certain team members about your ability to collaborate. Concerns? I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. What concerns? And from who? She shook her head, clearly wanting to end the conversation. "I'm not at liberty to say. My advice? Focus on moving forward. There will be other opportunities." It was the most infuriating non-answer I'd ever heard. Moving forward felt impossible when I didn't even know what I was supposed to fix. Over the next few weeks, things at work began to shift. Or maybe it was just my perception. Conversations would pause when I walked into a room. People I used to chat with openly were suddenly stiff and overly polite. It felt like I had become the subject of office gossip, though I had no idea what the story was. I kept replaying Jake's words in my head, wondering who had gone to HR. Who would gain something from making me look bad? For a while, I tried to convince myself it was just bad luck, a random, baseless rumor that had spiraled out of control. But the gnawing feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The final straw came during a quarterly review with HR. I decided to ask outright about the supposed complaints against me. The HR rep hesitated, then said, "There were concerns raised anonymously. We can't disclose details, but I assure you it wasn't personal." Not personal? My career had just been derailed, and it wasn't personal? I left that meeting angrier than I'd ever been. Someone was playing dirty, and I needed to find out who. At the time, I had no idea that the person pulling the strings wasn't just a coworker trying to get ahead. It was someone I never expected. Someone who had shared my childhood, my family dinners, and my biggest milestones. My own brother. But that revelation was still months away. For now, all I knew was that my hard work had been overshadowed by someone's lies, and I was determined to uncover the truth. 6 months after the promotion debacle, my family threw a massive reunion to celebrate my parents' anniversary. These gatherings were always a mix of nostalgia and chaos, with relatives crammed into my parents' house, kids running around, and endless conversations that ranged from harmless gossip to uncomfortable interrogations about life choices. This one felt no different, at least at first. Matt was there, as usual, soaking up attention like a sponge. My older brother had always been the family's golden child. Charming, ambitious, and, as my mom often said, a natural leader. I'd never begrudged him the role, but lately, his competitive streak had started to feel less like sibling rivalry and more like an all-out campaign to overshadow me. During dinner, Matt launched into a story about a major win at work. "So, we finally landed the Carmichael account," he said with a grin, pausing just long enough to let the name sink in. My fork froze midair. Carmichael was a client I'd been chasing for months. I'd poured hours into developing a proposal that, last I checked, was still under review. Hearing Matt casually claim them as his own felt like a slap in the face. I tried to keep my tone light. "Wow, Carmichael? Small world. I've been talking to them too. Guess you swooped in and stole my thunder, huh?" Matt's laugh was louder than it needed to be, almost forced. "Oh, come on, it's just business," he said, waving a hand as if the topic didn't matter. Then, without missing a beat, he changed the subject to his latest vacation plans. Something about his reaction didn't sit right with me. Matt loved to gloat, especially when it came to one-upping me. Why brush it off so quickly? After dinner, I stepped outside for some air, trying to shake off the weird vibe. That's when my cousin Emily approached me. She'd always been the family confidant, the one who somehow knew everyone's secrets before they did. "Hey," she said, lowering her voice, "can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said, bracing myself for a question about my non-existent love life or career woes. Emily glanced around, then leaned closer. "Did you know Matt's been talking to people at your company?" My stomach did a backflip. "What? No. Why would he be talking to anyone at my job?" She hesitated, like she wasn't sure how much to say. "I don't know all the details, but I overheard him on the phone a while back. He mentioned your company by name and said something about needing to smooth things over." It sounded odd. I forced a laugh, though my pulse was racing. "Probably just networking. You know Matt. He's always working some angle." Emily didn't look convinced. "Maybe, but if I were you, I'd keep an eye on him." Something about it felt off. I couldn't get Emily's words out of my head. Matt talking to people at my company? It didn't make sense. We worked in the same industry, sure, but at completely different firms. There was no reason for our professional circles to overlap, unless he was making them overlap on purpose. The more I thought about it, the more pieces of the puzzle started clicking into place. Matt landing the Carmichael account wasn't just a coincidence. He had known I was pursuing them. Had he gone out of his way to poach them? And what about the HR complaint that had cost me the promotion? It sounded ridiculous, but the idea that Matt might have been involved in that too suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. While the rest of the family was busy with breakfast chaos, I cornered Matt in the kitchen. "So," I said casually, "how'd you end up landing Carmichael?" "That's a pretty big deal." Matt glanced at me over his coffee mug, his expression unreadable. "Just good timing, I guess. Right place, right time." "Funny," I said, forcing a smile. "I've been working with him for months." "Didn't realize you were even in the running." His grin faltered for a split second before he recovered. "Yeah, well, you know how it is. Sometimes clients just click with a different pitch." It was subtle, but there was something in his tone, a hint of smugness, that set my nerves on edge. He wasn't just brushing me off. He was enjoying this. By the time the reunion ended, I felt like I was spinning in a web of half-truths and unanswered questions. Matt had always been competitive, but this felt like something else entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was deliberately undermining me, both at work and within our family dynamic. But why? What did he stand to gain from sabotaging me? As I drove home, my mind raced with theories. Maybe Emily was wrong. Maybe Matt's actions were innocent, and I was just reading too much into things. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just about Carmichael or a random phone call. Something bigger was going on, and I was determined to figure out what. The next morning, I woke up with Emily's words still swirling in my head. "Matt's been talking to people at your company." No matter how I tried to spin it, it didn't make sense. What business did Matt have with anyone at my workplace? The more I thought about it, the more suspicious it seemed. I started my search online, figuring LinkedIn would be the least conspicuous place to start. Scrolling through Matt's profile, I noticed several recent connections that immediately raised red flags. My boss, our HR manager, and even one of my closest coworkers were all on his list of new connections. My stomach churned. It wasn't unusual for professionals to network within the same industry, but this wasn't random. He wasn't just schmoozing. He was targeting people directly tied to my company. Still, LinkedIn connections didn't prove anything. For all I knew, Matt could have met them at a conference or during some unrelated work project. But with everything else that had happened, it felt too deliberate to ignore. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. My mind kept circling back to the HR complaint, the one that had torpedoed my promotion. Someone had gone out of their way to paint me as unreliable and difficult to work with. At the time, I assumed it was just office politics, but now, with Matt's connections to my coworkers staring me in the face, I couldn't help but wonder if he was involved. I decided to reach out to one of my closest work friends, Liz, who worked in the HR department. Liz was the type of person who knew everything about everyone in the office. If anyone could help me get to the bottom of this, it was her. Over lunch, I tried to keep my tone light. "Hey, random question for you," I began. "Do you remember that HR complaint about me a while back? The one that came up right before the promotion decision?" Liz raised an eyebrow. "Of course. It was the main reason they didn't move forward with you, right? What about it?" "Well," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I've always wondered where it came from. It felt so out of nowhere. Do you have any idea who filed it?" Liz hesitated, glancing around the cafe like she was worried someone might overhear. "You know, I'm not technically supposed to share that kind of information," she said, leaning in closer. "But between you and me, it was really strange. The complaint came from an external source, not someone in the office." I froze. "External? Like, outside the company?" She nodded. "Yeah. At the time, I thought it was odd, but the details seemed legit. The person claimed to have worked with you in the past and said you had a history of being difficult to collaborate with. Honestly, I didn't believe it, but HR took it seriously enough to flag your promotion. Do you remember the name?" I asked, trying to keep the urgency out of my voice. Liz hesitated again, then pulled out her phone. "Give me a second," she said, scrolling through her emails. "It's probably in the notes from the meeting." Finally, she stopped scrolling and looked up at me, her expression confused. The name listed was Matt. Matt, our last name. "Your brother." It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I sat there, staring at Liz as her words sank in. My own brother had filed the complaint that ruined my promotion. "You're sure it's him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Liz nodded, looking genuinely sorry. "I'm positive. I didn't connect the dots at the time, but now, I mean, how many Matts with your last name could there be? I'm so sorry. I had no idea it was your Matt." I thanked her quickly and left the cafe, my head spinning. Why would Matt do something like this? It wasn't just a casual slight or a misunderstanding. He had deliberately gone out of his way to sabotage me, and for what? A professional edge? Some petty competition? I spent the rest of the day replaying every interaction I'd had with Matt over the past year, looking for signs I might have missed. The Carmichael account, the odd tension at the reunion, his too casual deflection when I'd asked about his LinkedIn connections. It all started to paint a picture I didn't want to see. Matt wasn't just competitive. He was actively working against me, and I hadn't even realized it. But if Matt had gone so far as to file a fake HR complaint, what else had he done? The thought made my stomach turn. This wasn't just about one promotion. How many other opportunities had I missed because of his interference? I wanted to confront him right then and there, but I knew I needed more evidence. The HR complaint was damning, but if I went to Matt with just that, he'd find a way to spin it. I needed to be absolutely sure before I called him out. That night, I started digging deeper into Matt's online presence. I scrolled through old LinkedIn posts, Twitter updates, and anything else I could find. The more I looked, the more connections I found between him and people at my company, far more than I'd noticed earlier. Then I stumbled across a post that made my blood run cold. It was from a mutual contact of ours, congratulating Matt on his strategic insights that had helped their company secure a major client. The post was dated a week before the Carmichael account had pulled out of talks with my company. It was all starting to add up. Matt hadn't just poached Carmichael. He'd actively sabotaged my chances with them. And if he'd done it once, who's to say he wouldn't do it again? I closed my laptop, my heart pounding. Matt wasn't just a sibling rivalry gone wrong. He was a threat to my career, my reputation, and my sanity. And I wasn't going to let him get away with it. When I arrived at my parents' house that weekend, the tension in my chest felt unbearable. I had spent the last few days rehearsing what I would say to Matt. Every possible scenario played out in my head, from him denying everything to him breaking down in guilt and apologizing. Somehow, I still wasn't prepared for what actually happened. The house was buzzing with activity as always. My mom in the kitchen, my dad fiddling with the TV remote, and Matt lounging on the couch with his phone, looking as relaxed as ever. Just seeing him made my blood boil. How could he act so normal after everything he'd done? I waited until there was a moment when it was just the two of us in the living room. Matt barely glanced up from his phone when I walked in. "Hey," I started, keeping my voice steady. "We need to talk." Matt raised an eyebrow but didn't put his phone down. "Sure. What's up?" I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding. Then I just said it. "Why did you tell HR lies about me?" The room seemed to freeze. Matt finally looked up, his expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What are you talking about?" he asked, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. "The promotion," I said, my voice rising slightly. "The HR complaint. Don't play dumb, Matt. I know it was you." For a second, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. But then he laughed, a short, dismissive chuckle that made my skin crawl. "Oh, that," he said, as if I'd just brought up a minor misunderstanding. "Come on, it's not a big deal. You'll get another promotion. It's just business." I stared at him, stunned. "Not a big deal? You sabotaged me. You lied to HR, ruined my reputation, and cost me a huge opportunity. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Matt shrugged, like we were talking about a stolen parking spot and not my career. "Look, I'm sorry if it upset you, but you're making this way bigger than it needs to be. Sometimes you have to play dirty to get ahead. You should be proud of me for being resourceful." Proud of him? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Resourceful? I snapped. "You didn't just play dirty. You betrayed me, Matt. You're my brother." He sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Don't be so dramatic. It's not personal. I needed to make a move, and you were in the way. That's just how it works in this industry." I felt like I was going to explode. "You didn't just make a move. You targeted me. You've been targeting me for months. Do you even hear yourself?" Matt stood up, clearly done with the conversation. "Look, I don't know what you want from me. An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. But you're going to have to let this go eventually. It's not worth ruining the family over." That was the moment I decided to tell my parents. If anyone could make Matt understand the gravity of what he'd done, it was them. I found my mom in the kitchen, humming to herself as she chopped vegetables. "Mom, can we talk?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled, wiping her hands on a towel. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" I hesitated, then launched into everything. Matt's LinkedIn connections, the HR complaint, the Carmichael account, and his infuriating dismissal of the whole situation. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking. My mom listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When I was done, she sighed deeply and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I understand why you're upset," she said gently. "But Matt's just trying to do what's best for himself. You have to see it from his perspective." I pulled back, stunned. "From his perspective? Mom, he lied about me to ruin my career. How can you justify that?" "I'm not justifying anything," she said, her tone almost patronizing. "But you're both adults now, and the corporate world is tough." Matt probably felt like he didn't have another choice. Another choice? I repeated, incredulous. He didn't have to tear me down to get ahead. He could have succeeded on his own merits. She sighed again, like I was the one being difficult. "You can't hold a grudge, honey. It's not good for the family. These things have a way of working themselves out. When my dad got involved, it only made things worse." He listened to my story with a frown, but ultimately echoed my mom's sentiment. "Matt's ambitious," he said, as if that was an excuse. "He's always been like that. You know how competitive he is." "Competitive?" I said, my voice shaking. "This isn't some friendly rivalry. He deliberately sabotaged me, and you're acting like it's no big deal." "Because it isn't," my dad said firmly. "You'll bounce back. You always do. But Matt, he needed this. You should be proud that he's doing well for himself." That was the second time someone had told me to be proud of Matt for stabbing me in the back. It felt like I was living in an alternate reality where my feelings didn't matter, and his success justified everything. By the time I left my parents' house, I felt more alone than ever. Not only had Matt betrayed me, but my family, the people who were supposed to support me, were siding with him. As I drove home, one thought kept repeating in my mind. If they wouldn't stand up for me, I'd have to stand up for myself. Whatever Matt's reasons were, he wasn't going to get away with this. Not without consequences. After my disastrous confrontation with Matt, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his betrayal. His behavior at work, his cavalier attitude towards sabotaging me, and my family's refusal to hold him accountable, all felt like pieces of a much larger puzzle. I was determined to uncover the full picture, no matter how uncomfortable it might get. I started by retracing the financial arrangements my parents had mentioned over the years. Growing up, they had always been clear about the savings account they'd set aside for me and Matt. It wasn't an enormous sum of money, but they had emphasized that it was meant for significant life milestones, buying a house, starting a business, or covering an emergency. They'd been frugal for decades to ensure we both had a safety net. But something my mom had said during the confrontation with Matt now stuck out. Matt needed the money for an investment opportunity. At the time, I'd been too upset to question it, but the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. That account wasn't just for Matt. It was for both of us. How had he accessed it, and why hadn't anyone told me? I decided to ask my mom directly. It wasn't an easy conversation to approach, especially after how dismissive she'd been about Matt's sabotage, but I knew I had to. "Hey, Mom," I said casually during a phone call one evening. "I've been thinking about that savings account you mentioned a while back. Do you know how much is left in it?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh, well, actually, there isn't anything left in it," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "What?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened to it?" "Matt needed the money a few years ago," she said, as if that explained everything. "It was for a great investment opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime chance," he said. "And you know how persuasive Matt can be?" I was stunned. "So, he took the entire account? Every penny?" "Well, yes," she admitted, sounding slightly defensive. "But he promised to pay it back. He's just been a little delayed." "Delayed?" I repeated, incredulous. "Mom, that money wasn't just his. It was supposed to be for both of us. Did he even ask me if I was okay with this?" "Well, no," she admitted. "But we thought it made sense at the time. You didn't seem like you needed it, and Matt said he'd repay it soon enough." I felt a wave of anger and disbelief wash over me. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. Matt had taken something that wasn't entirely his, and my parents had let him get away with it, just like they were doing now with his sabotage. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't an isolated incident. Matt had a pattern of selfishness that my family refused to acknowledge. The HR complaint, the Carmichael account, the savings, it was all part of the same behavior. And yet, every time he crossed a line, they found a way to excuse it. I started digging into Matt's past, looking for other red flags I might have missed. It didn't take long to find them. For example, there was the time he borrowed my dad's car to impress a client and returned it with a dented bumper, and no explanation. My dad had paid for the repairs without so much as an apology from Matt. Then there was the time he'd taken out a loan in my mom's name to cover a short-term expense, only to default on it, leaving her to clean up the mess. Each time, my parents had brushed it off as Matt being ambitious or a little careless. I felt like I was the only one seeing the full picture. Matt wasn't just ambitious, he was entitled. He saw everyone around him as a resource to be used, and my family had been enabling him for years. The more I uncovered, the more isolated I felt. It was like I was trapped in some twisted reality where Matt could do no wrong, and I was the villain for calling him out. When I brought up the savings account to my dad, hoping he might see things differently, I was met with the same dismissive attitude. "Matt's always had big ideas," my dad said, as if that justified everything. "Sure, he's made some mistakes, but he's trying to build something. You can't hold that against him." "Dad, he took all the money," I said, my voice shaking. "That was supposed to be for both of us. Don't you think that's unfair?" "Life isn't always fair," he replied with a shrug. "And let's be honest, you've always been more responsible. You'll bounce back. Matt needed the help more than you did." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own parents were essentially punishing me for being responsible while rewarding Matt for his recklessness. By the time I hung up the phone, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. How could they not see what was happening? Matt wasn't just taking advantage of me, he was taking advantage of all of us. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my parents weren't just blind to Matt's behavior. They were complicit. They had enabled him at every turn, letting him take and take without ever holding him accountable. I knew I couldn't change them, but I also knew I couldn't keep letting Matt get away with this. If my family wasn't going to stand up to him, I would have to do it myself. If there was one thing I thought I could handle after everything with Matt, it was that he wouldn't cross a certain line, especially not one involving my career again. I was wrong. The day I saw the LinkedIn post, I was scrolling during a quick lunch break. It was one of those casual checks, nothing serious, just a moment to zone out from work stress. But then there it was. A picture of Matt shaking hands with someone I recognized immediately, Claire Thompson. Claire wasn't just anyone in my professional life. She was one of my most direct rivals, a person who had openly tried to undercut me on multiple projects in the past. She wasn't subtle about it, either. Claire's MO was swooping in, taking credit for others' ideas, and then using those stolen successes to climb higher. We'd clashed more than once, and it was no secret we couldn't stand each other. The caption under the post read, "Excited to announce our new partnership with Claire Thompson. Looking forward to achieving great things together." My lunch sat untouched as I reread the post over and over. Matt hadn't just gone behind my back this time. He had aligned himself with someone who had actively worked against me. It felt personal in a way I couldn't ignore. By the time I got home that night, my anger had turned into a full-blown storm. I called Matt, barely able to keep my voice steady as I asked him to meet me at a cafe near his apartment. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of catching me in a weak moment over the phone. When he walked in, he was his usual smug self, greeting me with an easy smile like nothing was wrong. "Hey, what's up? You sounded pretty worked up on the phone," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. I wasted no time. "Why are you working with Claire Thompson?" I asked, my voice sharp. Matt blinked, then smirked. "Ah, you saw the post. Claire's great, isn't she? Sharp, ambitious. My kind of person." "Your kind of person?" I snapped. "Do you even know what she's done to me? She's tried to sabotage my projects for years, Matt. And now you're teaming up with her?" Matt shrugged, completely unfazed. "It's not my fault you two have history. Claire's good at what she does, and she's helping me expand my network. This is just business, you know that?" "Business?" I repeated, my voice rising. "This isn't just business, Matt. You know exactly what you're doing. This isn't the first time you've gone out of your way to screw me over." That's when Matt's mask slipped. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "You really need to stop playing the victim here," he said. "This whole woe is me act is getting old. Maybe if you worked harder, you wouldn't have to worry about me." I stared at him, stunned. "Worked harder?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I've worked twice as hard as you for everything I've achieved, and you've done nothing but tear me down. The HR complaint, the Carmichael account, and now this? You've crossed every line. And you're sitting here acting like it's my fault?" Matt leaned back, looking almost bored. "You're just jealous because I'm more successful," he said flatly. "Admit it. You can't stand that I'm better at this than you." For a moment, I couldn't speak. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he said them, like he genuinely believed he was in the right. Like all of this was somehow my fault. When I told my parents what had happened, I was hoping, desperately, that this time, they'd see the truth. Surely, teaming up with someone who had openly tried to hurt me would be enough to make them understand. But when I sat down with them and explained everything, their reactions were depressingly familiar. My mom sighed, her face a mask of disappointment. Not at Matt, but at me. "Sweetheart, you're blowing this out of proportion," she said. "Matt's just doing what he needs to do to succeed. You can't take it so personally." "How am I not supposed to take it personally?" I shot back. "He's working with someone who's tried to destroy my career, Mom. How can you defend that?" She shook her head. "You're being dramatic. Matt's family, and family supports each other no matter what. And what about supporting me?" I demanded. "When has anyone held Matt accountable for anything he's done? He's sabotaged me, stolen from me, and now he's teaming up with Claire. And you're still making excuses for him." My dad cut in before my mom could respond. "You're both adults now," he said firmly. "This isn't something we need to get involved in. You and Matt need to work this out on your own." Their words felt like a slap in the face. I'd come to them for support, for validation that what Matt was doing was wrong, and all I got was more of the same. Let it go. Don't rock the boat. Family comes first. But in that moment, I realized something important. My parents weren't going to stand up for me. They never had, and they probably never would. To them, Matt was still the golden child, and nothing I said or did was going to change that. If I wanted to protect myself from Matt, I couldn't rely on my family. I was on my own, and as much as that hurt, it also made me more determined than ever. This was my breaking point. Matt had pushed me too far, and I wasn't going to let him keep walking all over me. Not anymore. After the blow-up with my parents and the realization that they wouldn't stand up for me, I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. Matt wasn't going to stop, not unless I forced him to. If I wanted to protect my career and my reputation, I needed hard evidence. Proof that he wasn't just an ambitious sibling but a calculated saboteur who didn't care who he hurt in the process. That night, I opened my laptop and started digging. I wasn't sure what I'd find or even where to start, but I knew Matt wasn't as careful as he thought. The first thing I went back to was his LinkedIn. Those connections to my coworkers weren't just for show. They were breadcrumbs leading straight to his meddling. As I clicked through profiles, I noticed something strange. One of my former coworkers, Jason, had left a comment on one of Matt's posts from about a year ago. It read, "Appreciate the insight you shared about your time working with my company's name. Helped a lot." My stomach dropped. Jason had been part of the team that worked on the project tied to the promotion I'd lost. What insight had Matt shared with him? I couldn't let it go. I started combing through old emails, looking for anything that connected Matt to the chaos at work. It was tedious and overwhelming, but slowly, things started to emerge. For one, I found an email thread from months ago where Jason had casually mentioned that someone external to the team had offered feedback on my work, calling it uninspired and lacking initiative. At the time, I'd brushed it off as office politics, but now, it felt like a smoking gun. Then I stumbled onto something even worse. A coworker I'd worked closely with during the Carmichael pitch had emailed me about a weird comment someone made to her at an industry event. Apparently, this person, who I later figured out was a friend of Matt's, had implied that I wasn't the easiest person to collaborate with and that I had a history of leaving projects unfinished. The pattern was clear. Matt wasn't just sabotaging me behind closed doors. He was actively spreading rumors about me, poisoning my reputation in ways I hadn't even realized. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. I wasn't just dealing with a few isolated incidents. Matt had been systematically undermining me for years, and he didn't even try to hide it. I went through old texts and messages, too, looking for any clues. That's when I found a text thread from over a year ago between Matt and our cousin Emily, the same cousin who had warned me about Matt talking to people at my company. The messages were casual, but one stood out. "Matt, don't tell me I said this, but I've been hearing things about her at work. She's kind of struggling, apparently. Just thought you should know." Emily's reply was vague, but the damage was already done. Matt had been planting seeds of doubt about me in our own family, twisting the narrative to make it seem like I wasn't capable of handling my career. I sat back, overwhelmed by everything I'd found. Emails, texts, LinkedIn connections, they all pointed to the same thing. Matt wasn't just trying to climb the corporate ladder. He was tearing me down in the process. And it wasn't enough for him to sabotage my career. He was actively trying to ruin my reputation entirely. The worst part was realizing how much damage he'd already done. I thought back to all the missed opportunities, the promotions I'd been passed over for, and the strange shifts in my relationships with colleagues. How many of those moments could be traced back to Matt's lies and manipulation? I thought about going public with everything. A part of me wanted to expose Matt for who he really was, to my family, to my coworkers, to everyone who thought he was this charming, ambitious golden boy. But the thought of the fallout stopped me in my tracks. My family had already made it clear where they stood. If I went public with this, they wouldn't see it as me defending myself. They'd see it as me tearing Matt down. And I knew how that would play out. My mom would call me selfish. My dad would accuse me of holding a grudge. They'd tell me to let it go, to be the bigger person. I imagined the looks on their faces if I told them everything I'd found. The texts, the rumors, the deliberate sabotage. Would they believe me? Or would they find a way to twist it, to make Matt's actions seem harmless and mine seem vindictive? I spent days agonizing over what to do. The evidence was damning, but using it felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I could come back from. Matt had already caused so much damage. Was it worth tearing my family apart to fight back? Eventually, I realized I couldn't make that decision until I had everything laid out in front of me. So, I kept digging. I scoured every corner of my email, every old message, every scrap of information that could connect Matt to his lies. The more I found, the clearer it became. I couldn't let this go. Matt had crossed too many lines, and if I didn't stand up for myself, he'd keep doing it. I wasn't just protecting my career anymore. I was protecting my integrity, my future, and my right to exist in a world where his lies didn't define me. By the time I finished, I had a mountain of evidence. Emails, texts, social media posts, and even a few witnesses who could corroborate Matt's involvement. It was painful to gather, knowing how much damage he'd done, but it also gave me a sense of control. For the first time in months, I felt like I was holding the reins. The question now was how far I was willing to go to use them. A few days after I had finished compiling all the evidence against Matt, I got a call from my mom. Her tone was unusually upbeat, almost overly sweet. That was my first clue something was up. "Honey, your dad and I have been talking," she said, her words measured, "and we think it's time for the family to have a little heart-to-heart. It'll be good for everyone." I immediately bristled. "What's this about, Mom?" "Well, Matt's been feeling a bit misunderstood lately. And honestly, we're worried about the tension. It's not good for anyone. She paused, then added, we're thinking of having everyone over for dinner this weekend. You can talk things out. Talk things out. I repeated, incredulous. You mean, you want me to sit there while Matt deflects, and you two tell me to let it go for the family's sake? No thanks. My mom sighed heavily, her patience clearly wearing thin. It's not just about Matt. It's about keeping the family together. You two need to work this out before it gets worse. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Part of me wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment my parents finally listened to me, that they'd see how deeply Matt had hurt me and actually hold him accountable. When I arrived at their house that Saturday, the air was thick with forced cheerfulness. My mom was bustling around the kitchen, pretending everything was fine, while my dad sat in the living room with Matt, laughing at something on the TV. Matt greeted me with his usual smug grin, like he didn't have a care in the world. Hey, glad you could make it, he said, as if he hadn't systematically tried to ruin my life. I forced a tight smile and sat down at the dining table, where my mom had already started setting plates. Once everyone was seated, my dad cleared his throat. All right, he began, let's talk about this tension between you two. It's gone on long enough, and it's time to move past it. Matt leaned back in his chair, looking relaxed and unbothered. I agree, he said smoothly. I think we should all just move on. There's no point in dwelling on the past. I stared at him, my jaw tightening. Move on? After everything you've done, you think I should just forget about it and pretend it didn't happen? He shrugged. What else is there to do? Drag it out forever? It's not like anything I did was personal. It's just business, and you need to stop taking it so seriously. I turned to my parents, hoping they'd finally back me up. Do you hear him? I said, my voice shaking. He sabotaged me, stole from me, spread lies about me, and you're asking me to just move on? My mom sighed, her expression weary. Sweetheart, I know you're hurt, but holding on to this anger isn't healthy. You're strong. You'll find success again. You always do. But Matt, he needed this. He's trying to make a name for himself, and sometimes that means making hard choices. Hard choices? I repeated, my voice rising. You're justifying everything he's done because he needed it? What about me? What about everything I've worked for? My dad leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. Look, we're not saying what Matt did was right, but he's your brother, and family comes first. You can't let something like this tear you apart. Maybe you're not as forgiving as we thought. That last comment hit me like a slap in the face. I'd always prided myself on being understanding, on giving people the benefit of the doubt. But forgiving Matt for this felt impossible. How could they expect me to sacrifice my future just to keep the peace? As the conversation dragged on, it became painfully clear that my parents had already chosen their side. No matter how much evidence I presented, Matt's lies, his sabotage, the money he'd taken, they always had an excuse. He's ambitious, my dad said. He's under a lot of pressure, my mom added. He's family, they both concluded, as if that was the only thing that mattered. Family? I finally snapped. How is it family when one of us is constantly taking and the rest of us are just supposed to accept it? When does it stop? Matt, who had been sitting silently for most of the discussion, finally spoke up. You're blowing this way out of proportion, he said, his voice calm but laced with condescension. You're jealous, plain and simple. You can't stand that I've figured out how to get ahead, while you're still stuck playing by the rules. I stood up, unable to take another second of his smug attitude. You're right about one thing, Matt, I said. I do play by the rules. And that's why, unlike you, I'll be able to sleep at night. As I walked out of the house, I felt a strange mix of anger and clarity. My parents had made their priorities clear. To them, Matt's success was more important than my integrity, my career, or my peace of mind. But I wasn't going to let their indifference stop me. Matt might have fooled them, but I knew the truth. And for the first time, I felt certain about what I needed to do. If my family wouldn't hold Matt accountable, I would. Whether they forgave me or not, I wasn't going to stay silent any longer. After the family meeting, it became painfully clear that nothing I said or did would change my parents' stance on Matt. They weren't going to hold him accountable. Worse, they didn't seem to understand, or care, how much damage he'd caused me. I spent days replaying the conversation in my head, thinking of all the things I should have said, all the points I could have made. But the truth was, none of it would have mattered. They had made their choice, and it wasn't me. That realization was like a knife to the heart. My family, the people I had always thought would be in my corner, had abandoned me in favor of maintaining their illusion of harmony. And Matt? He was more than happy to reap the benefits, acting like my anger was the real problem, not his betrayal. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep living like this, constantly walking on eggshells, trying to make my parents see reason while Matt continued to undermine me. It wasn't just exhausting, it was suffocating. So, I made the hardest decision of my life. I decided to go low contact with my family. At first, it felt like cutting off a limb. My mom called repeatedly, leaving voicemail after voicemail, each one more guilt-ridden than the last. "Sweetheart, we just want to talk," she'd say, her voice trembling. "You can't let this come between us. Family is everything." But every time I heard those words, they only reinforced my decision. To my mom, family meant keeping the peace at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing my well-being. To my dad, family meant excusing Matt's behavior because it was easier than confronting him. I couldn't live like that anymore. Going low contact didn't just mean ignoring my parents' calls. It meant setting boundaries in every part of my life. I stopped attending family events where I knew Matt would be. I told mutual friends that I didn't want updates about him or what he was doing. And I stopped sharing personal details with anyone who might pass them along to my parents. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I questioned whether I was making the right choice. But every time I thought about the alternative, staying in that toxic cycle, I reminded myself why I was doing this. Matt wasn't just a bad sibling. He was a threat to my career, my reputation, and my mental health. And if my family couldn't see that, then they didn't deserve a front-row seat in my life. I also knew I needed to protect myself from any future interference. Matt had already proven he was willing to cross boundaries I hadn't even thought to defend. If I wanted to move forward, I needed to make sure he couldn't keep sabotaging me. I started by consulting a lawyer. It felt extreme at first, like I was overreacting. But the more I explained the situation, the more justified it seemed. The lawyer helped me draft a cease and desist letter, outlining the ways Matt had interfered with my career and warning him to stop. It wasn't a lawsuit, but it was a clear message. I wasn't going to let him walk all over me anymore. Sending that letter was one of the most nerve-wracking things I've ever done. I half expected Matt to escalate things, to retaliate in some way. But to my surprise, he stayed quiet. Whether it was out of guilt, fear, or sheer arrogance, I didn't know. And honestly, I didn't care. The hardest part of all of this wasn't cutting ties with Matt. It was accepting that my family might never truly have my back. For years, I had convinced myself that no matter how much Matt and I clashed, our parents would always be the bridge that kept us connected. But that wasn't the case. My parents had chosen to prioritize Matt's feelings over my well-being, over and over again. At first, that realization devastated me. It felt like losing a part of myself, like the foundation I'd built my life on was crumbling beneath me. But over time, I came to see it differently. I couldn't control how my parents felt, and I couldn't make them see Matt for who he really was. But I could control how much power I gave them over my life. I could choose to walk away from their expectations, their guilt trips, and their endless justifications for Matt's behavior. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding. I found a new job at a company where my reputation wasn't tainted by Matt's lies. I started working on side projects I'd always been passionate about but never had time for. And slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again. There were still moments of doubt, times when I missed my family and wondered if I'd made the right choice. But every time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself of one simple truth. I deserved better. Better than Matt, better than my parents' indifference, and better than the toxic cycle I'd been trapped in for so long. Cutting ties wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was necessary. For the first time in years, I felt free. It's strange how much can change in 2 years. If you had told me back then that I'd be living the life I am now, feeling at peace, even happy, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, I was drowning in anger and betrayal, trying to pick up the pieces of a career and a family dynamic that felt irreparably broken. Now, I'm in a completely different place, both figuratively and literally. After cutting ties with my family, I poured myself into rebuilding my career. I knew I couldn't stay at my old company, not with the shadow of Matt's sabotage hanging over me. So, I left. It was a risky move, walking away from the only professional environment I'd known, but it was also liberating. I landed a job at a smaller but fast-growing firm where my skills were recognized and appreciated. It wasn't just about escaping Matt's reach, it was about starting fresh. At my new company, I didn't have to carry the baggage of the past. No one there knew me as the person whose brother had whispered lies behind her back. They only knew me as the hardworking, competent professional I was. That fresh start made all the difference. For the first time in years, I felt valued and respected. My new boss went out of her way to encourage my growth, and my team was collaborative in a way I hadn't experienced before. Slowly, my confidence started to rebuild itself. But I didn't stop there. Inspired by the freedom of a new environment, I decided to pursue a side project I'd been dreaming about for years. It started small, just an idea I played with in my spare time, but it quickly grew into something real. Before I knew it, I was running my own side business, doing work that was fulfilling and completely mine. That business became a lifeline, not just financially but emotionally. It reminded me that I didn't need Matt, or even my family's approval, to succeed. My success could be entirely my own. As for Matt, he's still out there, doing his thing. I see his occasional LinkedIn posts, always bragging about his latest, big win or partnership. For a while, just seeing his name made my blood boil. I'd get flashes of all the ways he'd hurt me, all the lies and manipulation he'd used to get ahead. But over time, something shifted. I stopped caring. Matt might still be playing his games, but they no longer define me. His actions are a reflection of who he is, not who I am. Letting go of that resentment wasn't easy. It took therapy, a lot of self-reflection, and more than a few sleepless nights. But eventually, I realized that holding on to my anger only kept me tied to him, and I was done letting Matt have that kind of power over me. My relationship with my family is complicated, to say the least. After I went low contact, my parents didn't take it well. My mom called constantly at first, leaving tearful voicemails about how much she missed me and how she just wanted things to go back to the way they were. My dad was quieter, sending the occasional text asking if I was okay, but never directly addressing the elephant in the room. Over time, the calls and messages slowed down. They didn't stop entirely. Every now and then, I'll get a holiday card or a text checking in, but it's clear that they still don't fully understand why I set boundaries. At first, that bothered me. I wanted them to see things from my perspective, to acknowledge how much Matt's actions hurt me and how their refusal to hold him accountable only made it worse. But I've come to accept that they might never get it. And honestly, that's okay. Sometimes, choosing yourself means walking away, even from the people you thought would always be in your corner. It's one of the hardest lessons I've ever had to learn, but it's also one of the most important. My family might never fully understand my decision, and they might never apologize for the ways they let me down. But I've made peace with that. My life is my own now, and it's better than I ever imagined it could be. I've built a career I'm proud of, created something meaningful with my side business, and surrounded myself with people who genuinely support me. It's not perfect, and there are still moments when I miss the family we used to be. But those moments are fleeting, and they don't define me anymore. I've learned that sometimes, the best thing you can do is let go. Not out of weakness, but out of strength. Because walking away from toxicity, even when it comes from the people you love, is one of the most empowering things you can do. So, here I am, 2 years later, living a life that's entirely my own. And for the first time in a long time, I feel free.